This is the RK2023, a 3.5-inch retro game emulation handheld from PowKiddy that has really taken me by surprise. After a string of underwhelming or straight up poor devices, PowKiddy announced this odd-looking little handheld, which is the spiritual successor to the RK2020. The RK2023 comes with a 3.5-inch screen that has a 4:3 aspect ratio display, a full dual analog stick control layout with inline shoulder buttons, along with a powerful CPU and an open source operating system. With all this in mind, the RK2023 should offer some very decent emulation performance, with Saturn, Dreamcast, N64 and PSP all well within the realms of possibility, and all within this very small, uniquely designed handheld. With a $75 price tag, will this little handheld deliver on its potential, and will it rise above the common e-waste grade handhelds from PowKiddy? Let's go ahead and take a look. Hello and welcome to Retro Breeze. The RK2023 comes shipped in a pretty typical PowKiddy fashion. A simple box, a USB cable, and a manual, and that's about it. By the way, this RK2023 was sent to me for review by my friends over at Mech DIY. Mech DIY sell many different retro handhelds at reasonable prices, and also offer great customer service and fast shipping times. I'll leave a link to their website in the description box below if you're interested in checking them out. And a big thank you again to them for sending me this device. Anyway, here's the PowKiddy RK2023 in the flesh. And before I start, there's an elephant in this room to address. Yes, you're seeing this right. My particular RK2023 came with two X buttons instead of an X and a Y. This is definitely weird, but it's the only time I've ever seen this issue with the device. So I'm just going to ignore it as a one-off human error and not get too hung up on it. Actually, I think it's quite a charming and funny detail for quite a charming and funny little handheld. Before I get to my thoughts, let's go ahead and go through some speed facts. This device comes with an RK3566 processor, 1GB of RAM, and a 3500 mAh battery. It has a 3.5-inch screen with a 4:3 aspect ratio. There's no onboard storage, but instead you get dual SD card slots, one for the OS and one for your games. It also has dual stereo speakers, and there's no Wi-Fi or Bluetooth on board. We'll get to that a little bit later. It has a full dual analog stick control layout with inline shoulder buttons. It is 151.5mm wide at its widest point, 78mm tall, and 17.5mm thick. It weighs 173 grams or so with two SD cards inserted. It uses an open source Jealous operating system with custom firmware options too. And bonus features include a 3.5-inch headphone jack, HDMI output, and controller support. My first impressions is that this thing feels, well, a little bit cheap. Or maybe cheap isn't the right word, because it's actually pretty solid in its construction. It's just all very utilitarian plastic. It's fine, but just nothing fancy at all. It does have a bit of rattle when you shake it, but it's not the worst that I've heard. My second impression is that the RK2023 is a very pleasing and comfortable shape, which has been compared to the PSP Go. However, outside of this superficially similar shape, it's really not like the PSP Go at all actually. It's much bigger and much thicker and just chunkier than that. It is very comfortable to hold though, and thanks to the curved edges here, it sits very nicely in the hands. PowKiddy have done an absolutely stellar job in making this device very compact, including the control layout. In fact, the controls here are so well placed that they allow my fingers to easily reach all of the buttons with no problem at all, and that's even whilst having my thumbs on the analog sticks too. The back of the device is completely flat with a dimpled design toward the edges, but don't think that these improve ergonomics, they're purely decorative. One of my favorite design aspects of the RK2023 is how the top and the bottom are set apart from the rest with these strips of flat plastic, containing the various slots, buttons, and ports. Along the top there's the volume keys, which continue PowKiddy's infuriating trend of having them backwards, with the volume up on the left and the volume down on the right, and then the mini HDMI out, a reset button which is sensibly recessed to prevent accidental presses, and the power button. On the bottom you'll find dual stereo speakers, a USB-C charging port, the primary SD card slot, a 3.5mm headphone jack, the second SD card slot, and a second USB-C port for OTG, which means peripherals. The design language overall is just kinda playful, fun, and a little bit different, but it's also clean and smart too. It's not overly toy-like, but it's certainly not a hardcore RGB gamer aesthetic either. Overall, I feel like the device is just very, very well thought out, and it's very comfortable and just kinda fun. One design aspect that I think everybody will notice right away is the branding on the screen bezel. I really have no idea why PowKiddy would actually pay money to include this. It's totally beyond me, and they really should have just not done that. When it comes to controls, the RK2023 has the typical dual analog stick layout, with 2 sticks situated underneath the D-pad and face buttons. The sticks themselves are recessed deeply into the body, which keeps them well out of the way when you don't need them. They're just the same size as Nintendo Switch analog sticks, and feel just the same as that as well. There's some padding inside that makes L3 and R3 click in a nicely muted way, and the wide cutouts they're in mean that their rotation is completely unrestricted. They feel good, and with a thumb on each stick, all the other inputs are well within reach, including the shoulder buttons. This is really nice because typically on handheld devices, it can be a struggle to stretch your fingers up to the shoulder buttons while you use the sticks. But the compact layout of these controls means that it's just not an issue here at all. Again, this is just a really good design. The face buttons are some of my favorite yet from PowKiddy. They're a very lightly textured and smooth plastic with a nice and slightly domed shape. There's a perfect amount of force needed to push these. There's no mushiness and they snap back very nicely on release. There's plenty of travel and they stick up around 1mm or so when they're fully depressed. Seriously, these are lovely face buttons. Some of the best I've ever used, in fact. They're also surprisingly large, especially for the size of the handheld. For reference, these buttons are a whole millimeter wider in diameter than the Switch Joy-Con buttons. And I think that these are honestly just some of my favorite buttons yet, in general, not just PowKiddy. The D-pad on the RK2023 is probably its most divisive element. It's an unusual shape and size, but all things considered, it's a very functional D-pad. It's a bit softer to push than the face buttons, which is good because it allows for easier sliding between the directions. It also has some nice thunkiness to it. It pivots well in each direction too. The size of it overall is great, and I like the depression in the center, which really does help orient your thumb. However, there's a pretty big and unfortunate problem with the D-pad, and that is the very sharp edges of it. If you see here, there's hardly any roundedness to these edges at all, and you can really feel that sharpness under your thumb. For me personally, it's not a deal breaker because I got pretty used to it, but it's just not as comfortable as it should be, especially for fighting games where you'll be sliding over these edges constantly. Now I actually found my own solution to this, and it was basically keeping my thumb in the center and rolling it around, almost like a slider. It works well with no discomfort for anything other than fighting games. The D-pad actually does have a little bit of cardinal tilt, meaning that I can hold down on a direction and tilt it to activate the perpendicular directions. Here's what I call the crash test. With bad cardinal tilt, Crash will tend to move diagonally instead of moving forward with only a slight move of the D-pad. But in this case it only happens when I actually tilt it very intentionally. I think the amount of tilt here is good because it doesn't get in the way of your gameplay, but it makes it easier to hit diagonals quickly when you need to. All in all, this is just a really excellent D-pad in every way except for those sharp edges, which is a real shame. I'm hoping that they'll get to improve this D-pad eventually and just soften out those edges, because then I think it would be pretty close to top tier. Anyway, the last inputs on the face are the start and select buttons, and unfortunately they are extremely clicky, snappy, and loud. I don't know why PowKiddy always cheaps out in weird areas like this. Sure, start and select aren't a huge deal and you don't use them often, but playing in public is actually a little bit embarrassing because of them. I was on a train recently and it was just really cringy whenever I had to press these buttons and they snapped super loud. I know everybody could hear it. The shoulder buttons are not as bad, but they're still pretty clicky and louder than I would ideally like them to be. However, I do really like how they kind of spill over the side of the device, and you can press them in totally horizontally from the side. The L2 and R2 are also raised up, and for inline buttons I think this design is really good. It means that I can hit L2 and R2 with my fingertips, and L1 and R1 with the joint of my fingers. Overall, the controls on the RK2023 are seriously good, especially for the size of the device. I'd like the shoulders to be less clicky and the edges of the D-pad softened, but during gameplay it's a very comfortable and precise experience. Now let's talk about the display. And this is easily one of the most beautiful displays I've ever seen on a retro handheld, and that is not an exaggeration. The small size and relatively high resolution mean that it's incredibly sharp, and it gets extraordinarily bright. The maximum brightness on the RK2023 is an absolute sight to behold. It is easily one of the brightest displays I've ever seen on anything, and it doesn't get washed out at all despite that. The colors positively burst out of the screen, and literally anything you decide to play on this is going to look absolutely beautiful because of it. It's so incredibly good that it puts almost every other device I have to shame, including some of the premium devices. The brightness also makes it completely viable to play outside in bright, direct sunlight too. In addition, it also gets very dim, which is ideal for nighttime use. And it is also completely customizable through the system settings, where you can adjust the gamma, contrast, saturation, and hue. I don't think I can really give any words that will describe just how good the screen on the RK2023 is, and I have absolutely no idea how PowKiddy squeezed it onto a $75 device. The only concern I have here is the exact same thing I just raved about, the brightness. At higher brightnesses, I genuinely started to notice eye strain very quickly, which is something that I never suffer from. So I would just advise being careful and keeping the brightness at reasonable levels most of the time. For me, 40% brightness, yes 40%, is perfectly bright and matches the maximum brightness on most of my other handhelds. That said, you just have to see what the colors in Knuckles Chaotix look like at maximum brightness at least one time. It is stunning. So, here we have a compact little device with really good controls and an absolutely beautiful screen. Before we jump into some games, let's talk about the user experience. The RK2023 uses the Just Enough Linux operating system, also known as Jealous. But don't get scared of the Linux thing, you're not going to interact with it at all. The OS uses a front end called Emulation Station, which is a common and popular one. Emulation Station is incredibly user-friendly, and at a basic level, all you really need to do is just choose a game and play. If you want to change settings, such as how your games look or which emulators you want to use, you can do it all through this UI, instead of having to launch games, open RetroArch, save settings, etc. that way. Everything is easily available in the main UI. Also, there's many themes available to customize your experience, and additional features like Ports Master, which lets you play a number of native ports, are available after a little bit of configuration. The RK2023 does have internet-connected features, like its ability to use retro achievements or scrape box art for your game collection. However, the device itself doesn't have Wi-Fi inbuilt, so we need to connect a Wi-Fi dongle to the OTG port to make those features work. On the stock OS, I have found some bugginess with the Wi-Fi connection, for example occasional dropouts, and very long loading times when connecting or disconnecting from Wi-Fi. The RK2023 also has a number of custom firmwares available, such as Unofficial OS, and my favorite, ArcOS. Because the operating system on the RK2023 is run directly from the SD card, you can easily install custom operating systems on new SD cards while preserving the original one too. Also, you can usually share your game collection on the second SD card between all the different custom OSs as well. For example, I kept my stock card with Jealous on it just as it is, and then I got a second SD card that I installed ArcOS on. Whenever I want to, I can put in the Jealous operating system to go back to that, or the ArcOS SD card to boot into ArcOS instead. It's a really good, foolproof setup. Another great benefit is that there's no onboard storage that you could potentially brick. So if something goes wrong, you'll most likely be able to fix it by reinstalling an OS on your SD card, and you won't lose any of your games because they're all on the second SD card. If you'd like to learn how to install ArcOS, please check out the tutorial I made that's on screen now. But for now, let's jump into some emulation and see if the performance can keep up with everything else we've seen so far. The RK2023 blows away pretty much all 2D retro systems. Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Genesis, Super Nintendo, everything is flawless and runs at full speed, including the very heavy-hitting titles like Yoshi's Island, which usually has lag on lower-end devices. The same can be said for arcade systems in Neo Geo. Pretty much everything, the overwhelming majority of games, will run without issue, and if they do have issues, it's most likely to do with the emulator and not the performance itself. The 4:3 aspect ratio display really shines when it comes to this old school content, because it fills the entirety of the screen without any black borders, and the pixels look super crisp. The RK2023 has power to spare though, and you'll easily be able to apply filters and other effects on your games with no trouble at all. Oh, and before I forget, the stereo speakers on this device are really nice as well, with a bright sound that doesn't distort at high volumes. And actually the highest volume here doesn't seem to be unreasonably high either. In general, I don't think you're going to be left wanting anything with these speakers. When it comes to 3D systems, PS1 performance is again flawless. And something I find funny is that you can turn on upscaled resolution and still get pretty much perfect performance with every game. But on this super small and sharp screen, there's really not much of a noticeable difference. PS1 games look absolutely great in general on this screen, even if you don't upscale them at all. And you even get the bonus of having dual analog sticks for games like Ape Escape. Sega Saturn can run incredibly well on the RK2023, but I found that directly out of the box it was unplayably slow in every single game. However, with a little tweaking and an update to the OS, I was able to get it running at full speed in most games. In my experience, the ArcOS custom firmware gave me the absolute best possible Saturn performance, and I was playing nearly everything at full speed. I always love to test Sega Touring Car Championship. It has to run at full speed without exception to be at all playable, and here it is, running at full speed. This game is the Dark Souls of racing games. Now we're getting on to the heavy hitters, starting with N64. Did I mention this pocket-friendly handheld plays N64 and plays it well? There are a few higher-end N64 games that might have a stutter or two here and there, but for the most part you'll be able to enjoy the entire N64 catalog with little exception. Recently I've been playing Smash Remix, which is a hack of Smash 64 that adds a ton of new stages and characters like Sonic, Mewtwo, and even Marina from the N64 hidden gem Mischief Makers. And this game has been an absolute blast to play on the RK2023, with no slowdown or anything like that. When it comes to Sega Dreamcast, the performance is pretty great overall, with the majority of the library running perfectly, or at least extremely well. Once you get to heavier games like Sonic Shuffle, you'll start to run into some distracting but not always necessarily game-breaking slowdown. However, when you get to the heaviest of the heavy hitters like Crazy Taxi 2, you'll really start to push the absolute limits of what the RK2023 can do. Enabling auto frame skip may help in some games and make them somewhat playable, but overall there are definitely some out-of-reach games on the Dreamcast. Now let's take a look at the Nintendo DS. Performance-wise, the DS runs absolutely great without any problems, and once again it looks excellent on the 4:3 aspect ratio display. But gameplay-wise, it's a little bit awkward. You can flip between the screens or view both of them at once, and you can use the right analog stick to control an on-screen stylus. I'd say that for games that rely mostly on one screen and have very few touch controls, you can get some enjoyable DS gameplay from the RK2023, but for anything that remotely uses two screens at once or heavy touch controls, it's just not going to be a great experience at all. For example, Elite Beat Agents is out of reach because you need to touch the screen constantly, and Sonic Rush is out of reach because you transfer between the top and the bottom screen constantly as well. On the other hand, Mario Kart DS is a great example of a game that runs really well, because you don't really require the use of touch, and you don't really need the second screen either. Anyway, the final system to look at here is the Sony PSP, and once again for the most part you'll get really solid performance in most games, but you will also definitely start to hit some upper limits. There's a huge amount of variance between PSP games though. For example, Tekken 6 will run at full speed even with minor upscaling, and it looks absolutely great. Other games will work well with no upscaling at all, or maybe with some frame skip. But on the other hand, heavy titles like God of War are totally and completely unplayable. However, despite the performance, PSP just isn't the best system to play here, due to the 4:3 aspect ratio display. You're going to have a lot of letterboxing on the top and the bottom, and a tiny active screen area, which makes elements, especially like text, hard to see. If you try and stretch the image, it looks absolutely horrible. And in general, whilst you're able to play PSP and you might get some enjoyment out of a game here or there, this certainly isn't the best system to buy if you're looking to play PSP games. However, this does bring me comfortably into the consoleized features that the RK2023 has to offer. That is, HDMI output and controller support. Using a mini HDMI cable, you can connect the RK2023 to an external display and play your games on the big screen. It also scales properly to match the screen that you connect it to. So if you connect it to a regular TV or a monitor, you'll be able to play 16:9 content like PSP, or even widescreen Dreamcast games with absolutely no problem, and it's much more enjoyable to do so. Note that you do have to reboot the console with the cable inserted. It's not a hot plug experience like it is on some other devices. And with the HDMI cable inserted, you can actually use the RK2023 itself as your control pad, or you can attach a wired controller using the OTG USB port. Going even further than that, you can actually connect a USB hub and then attach multiple controllers to that for multiplayer gameplay. I've tested this with up to 4 controllers and it works flawlessly, albeit after a little bit of configuration. And I just love the fact that my $5 cheap Amazon USB hub worked without any issues at all. But if you'll allow me to indulge you a little bit further, how about connecting a mouse and a keyboard and using them for some old school DOS games? it absolutely works on the RK2023 as well. So all of that considered, you have some incredible flexibility here. The only major issue I've run onto with the RK2023 is that I have not been able to get Bluetooth to work at all on this device. I hear that you need to use one of a specific few types of dongle, and I guess I just don't have the right one. I assume it will work well if you can find the right dongle, but it is a little bit frustrating that a mainstream TP-Link dongle that I have from Amazon just didn't work. So anyway, on the whole, the emulation performance, flexibility, and the overall gaming experience on the RK2023 is seriously impressive, especially for its price. Just a year ago, I would have never imagined a handheld that could capably handle Saturn, N64, and Dreamcast like this, let alone one that had full features like HDMI output and a wide array of peripheral support. Unfortunately, the battery is one aspect of the RK2023 that just isn't so great. Not the battery life itself, which seems to be pretty respectable at anywhere between 3 to 8 hours depending on what type of game you're playing, but just how weird and unpredictable it is. The percentage displayed on the operating system just seems to change at random sometimes, and it has been common for me to have no idea whatsoever that the battery was anywhere close to being low, only for the device to shut itself off mid-game. There's no indication of a low battery anywhere as far as I can see, and the battery percentage number displayed just isn't reliable or trustworthy. I've heard rumors that the RK3566 processor itself has some problems with battery management, so I'm guessing that's really where the problem lies. Oh yeah, and the RK2023 also suffers from an increasingly common quirk with retro handhelds these days. You cannot charge it with a USB-C to USB-C cable. It just won't work. You need a USB-C to USB-A cable instead. It's a minor annoyance, but I think it's about time that manufacturers start putting in full USB-C charging support. So we've covered a lot in this video so far, so it's time to wrap up with my final thoughts and opinions on the PowKiddy RK2023. The first topic I'm going to cover is how beginner friendly is this device. And I'm happy to say that the RK2023 is a device that absolutely anybody would be able to pick up and play easily. And also one that is not easy to mess up at all due to the simple operating system that is easy to restore and difficult to mess up in the first place. In fact, I would go as far as to say the RK2023 is an excellent device for both playing and learning about retro handhelds and how to operate them. Now let's talk about the price and value. And you might be surprised for me to tell you to maybe not buy this particular device. And that's because PowKiddy have just released a brand new one that has built-in Wi-Fi for just $10 more. And I highly recommend getting that one for the mild convenience of Wi-Fi. It is, however, only available in black, but as an added bonus, they've removed that awful branding from the bottom of the screen as well. That said, regardless of which you buy, the RK2023 is a stunningly great handheld for under $100. Now let's get on to my overall likes, dislikes, and my final opinion on the PowKiddy RK2023. Starting with my likes. I like the quirky yet functional and compact design. I think it has excellent controls and overall ergonomics. It has really solid performance, and it plays pretty much everything it should be able to play incredibly well. It offers massive flexibility with HDMI output and peripheral support. I just love how you can turn this thing into an entire multiplayer console with just some wired controllers and TV output. I like that there is tons of custom firmware already and a huge amount of community support for this device. And finally, it's just overall a really fun, casual device. There's nothing majorly wrong with it, which is actually amazing considering it's a PowKiddy device. Now for my dislikes. And first up is the overly loud and clicky start and select buttons, and by extension, but lesser so, the shoulder buttons. I think they should just soften these out and stop them from being so loud. Next is the backwards volume keys. This might actually be just a cultural difference, but I find it really frustrating that I've had 4 different PowKiddy devices with the volume up on the left and the volume down on the right. I'm never going to get used to it. More importantly, the weird battery issues. It's not that the battery life is bad on this device at all, it's really not. It's just that you don't really have any idea where it's at any particular time. And by extension to that one, no USB-C to USB-C charging is supported. It's time to support that feature. And of course, the biggest problem with the RK2023 is the very sharp edges on the D-pad. For me personally, it's not a deal breaker, but it absolutely will be for some people. And it's a real shame because other than those sharp edges, this is actually a really good D-pad. Overall, I think that the RK2023 is one of the best value devices to ever hit the handheld market. And other than a few quirks, PowKiddy totally knocked it out of the park. If somebody asked me today what the best handheld under $100 was overall, I think I would say this one. And I really do recommend it that much. Just to put this in perspective, the last PowKiddy review I did for the X51 I said that it felt like PowKiddy had just given up because it was so bad. The RK2023 is an incredible U-turn for this company, and a device that I feel had a lot of love and passion and heart put into it. In fact, they even listened to their customers and quickly released a new model with Wi-Fi and no screen brand, just like everybody was asking for. It really feels like a new direction for this company, and I really hope that I'm right about that. So that's it for this one. What is your opinion on the PowKiddy RK2023? Will you be picking one up? If so, please go ahead and check out Mech DIY in the description box below, who provided this device for me to review. They offer great prices, fast shipping, and great customer service too. You can also check out PowKiddy.com if you prefer to buy it direct. Let me know in the comment box below if you like this device, and if you have one. Let me know what you're playing on it if you do. Also, please leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, it does help me out a lot. And subscribe to my channel for more content like this, including my upcoming PowKiddy X28 review, which might surprise you because of how much I love it. This has been Shem from Retro Breeze. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.